Francis, welcome to Tehelka with Skype. I'll start off with your book. You've spoken about the highly dubious role played by the UN in regards to the conflict in Sri Lanka, and most commentators watching the situation would say that the UN resolution does not accurately describe the extension of the violations of human rights committed by the armed forces there. What do you make of the UN's resolution at the moment?
Well, you're quite right. The UN resolution doesn't even mention the word war crimes, and at this point is really only asking the Sri Lankan government to implement the findings of its own internal inquiry, which I think every major human rights group concedes was deeply flawed in its construction and its remit.
True.
So, it was very problematic. That Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, as it's called, totally whitewashed the Sri Lankan army in terms of war crimes. However, you have to see the good things in it. The good thing in that report was that it had some sensible recommendations for improving human rights in Sri Lanka generally. So I think the international community felt, well, okay, at least if we can get those pushed through, that'll make a huge difference to the future. And of course, what we've seen is a backsliding on all Sri Lanka's commitments to do that. And so now I think a growing international impatience with Sri Lanka and a slight embarrassment that they supported this government.
True. Do you see some willful understatement in what the UN is asking for? Because there are parts in your book which mention how the UN's own Tamil staff was raped and killed, some of them, and not, as you pointed out earlier, they've not been described as war crimes in the resolution. So do you think it's a willful understatement of the situation? How do you read that?
Well, I think there's two different bits of the UN here. I mean, there's the UN in New York, Ban Ki-moon's office, and their colleagues in Sri Lanka, and I think they haven't done enough to put right their grave failures, and I'm using their own term there, their grave failings in Sri Lanka. They should have done a lot more to set the record straight after the Charles Petrie report, the internal inquiry that came out last year that really pointed to Sri Lanka being Ban Ki-moon's Rwanda moment, and nothing having been learnt from Sri Lanka. And then I think on the other hand, you've got the council in Geneva, and that's really a political body, because as you know as well as I do, depends who sits on the council, and you have to lobby those groups. And I think that the Human Rights Council's very efficacy and justification for existence is at stake here, because that was the council that at the end of the war in Sri Lanka actually patted Sri Lanka on the back and said, well done, you defeated the terrorists, and totally ignored the fact that tens of thousands of people had been slaughtered. And if now, 4 years on, they can't really seize the moment and do something about Sri Lanka, then really what is the point of this body?
True. In an interview earlier with the Tehelka reporter, when you talked about your book, you talked about how you had found through a leaked report that the number of people missing to be much higher than recorded, as against the official statement, I think, of 40,000 people dead, as against the unofficial version of 100,000 people dead. Do you think enough is being done on the front of disappearances? How do you see that?
Well, I think this issue of the death toll is very, very important, because obviously it tells us as journalists, members of the public, the scale of the tragedy that took place. And 40,000 is the figure quoted by the UN panel of experts. That then got raised to 70,000 last year when the UN had this internal inquiry. It said possibly 70,000. I had the World Bank data looking at least 100,000 missing, and we've just recently had Sri Lankan social scientists who've been doing village surveys who've come up with a figure missing from 2009 of 118,000 people. And when you start to look at the government data, there's an enormous number of people unaccounted for, and absolutely no explanation given for where they might be. If we're talking, and I'm not saying we definitely are, because I haven't counted the bodies, but if we're talking on a scale of 70 to 100,000, we're talking equivalent to the entire Yugoslav war in Europe. Everybody has heard of that, but who has heard of Sri Lanka in Europe, let alone elsewhere?
True. How do you think this resolution will be perceived in Sri Lankan society, in majoritarian society?
Well, I think, the majority community, the Sri Lankan singular community, and those who support the government are obviously very upset about the series of resolutions we've had, the one last year and this one. And they've fought tooth and nail against it, and threatened and intimidated anybody who's been part of the process. So clearly they take it very badly, and in that sense it is putting some pressure on that government. But for the victims of this war, this is not justice.
True. What could be certain domestic changes that this resolution could bring inside Sri Lanka on the ground?
To be honest, I'm not sure that this resolution will make a huge difference to people in the north and east of the country. I think, the problem with the resolution and the process in Geneva, from my perspective, is that it's couched in terms of progress. And it assumes that post-war, the Sri Lankan government wants to reconcile and put right what happened, and that it's not actually a triumphalist regime. And I think increasingly, we need to rethink that dialogue, that discourse of progress. That's something that actually Alan Keenan from International Crisis Group has written very articulately about, and I think he's right. We're not seeing progress, we're seeing backsliding. So if you look at the impact in the short term, there may not be much impact, but I think there has to be a lot more pressure. I mean, if you look internationally, of course, the impact of this resolution may be that there'll be a rethinking as to the Commonwealth engagement with Sri Lanka. I mean, Sri Lanka will now be hosting and heading the Commonwealth for the next 2 years, and the major event, biannual event, is going to take place in Sri Lanka in November. And I hope that this UN resolution will cause other Commonwealth nations to think twice about whether they want to be headed by a country accused of crimes against humanity by the United Nations.
So in the last 6 months, with the war in Sri Lanka and the situation there, how would you describe it? Could you give us a little context of what happened?
The last phase of the Sri Lankan war was completely different from previous decades. It was much, much worse. We're talking about people who were displaced up to 40 times in 5 months. They slept rough in the open. They were starved. They had to live off kanji, rice and water, gruel, as it were, the day. They were bombed, they were shelled, they were clustered into very, very densely packed civilian areas with tents right on top of each other and vehicles, and they sheltered in these areas that grew smaller and smaller and smaller and were under sometimes constant bombardment, so that people would lie awake in the bunkers at night and they would hear people in the next door bunker screaming in agony as they died, and they could not get out of their bunkers and save them. They would manage after several hours to get out of the bunker, and they would have to bury with shovels body parts of their neighbors and friends. I mean, they were lucky if they actually, they could find the whole body and bury it. They found babies' heads in trees. I mean, some of the stories are unimaginable, the suffering that people went through. And then when they got through that, and if they survived, they walked out and they were put in a mass detention camp. And, people were randomly disappearing, women were being raped, and they were told that they had to stay there for months and months and months in conditions that were pretty unsanitary. And so most of the people I met paid huge bribes to the security forces to escape. The security forces who had detained them in the name of national security to screen them for being so-called terrorists.
You've also mentioned, there's this one part in your book which talks about how doctors would pass on information to government about 6 or 7 of their hospitals in safe zones, and how they were targeted time and again willfully, if I could say that, and then certain hospitals which were not talked about were not targeted at all. So how do you see that?
Yes, shall I tell you about that? Yes. One of the doctors I spoke to, one of the few government doctors, a civil servant working for the Sri Lankan state, said that not only did he paint a huge red cross on the roof of every hospital building, makeshift building he took over as a hospital. I mean, these were not hospitals, they were nursery schools, primary schools. And not only did he do that, he sent the GPS positions to the International Red Cross to pass on to the Sri Lankan military, so that these could be declared humanitarian sites that should be protected by international law in a war. And he did this 7 times. And every time the hospital was bombed or shelled within days or hours. And the last 5 sites, he didn't send the details to the ICRC. He kept it back and they weren't hit. So he concluded that they were being deliberately targeted. And in terms of deliberate targeting of civilian sites, we know from the 2 UN workers who were on the final food convoy in late January, who went into the Rani, we know that they witnessed deliberate and very, very intense shelling of a civilian safe zone established by the government and demarcated by the government unilaterally right on the front line. They saw very, very heavy bombardment of civilians there, and they were actually very lucky to escape with their lives and to get out at all. So they were witnesses to war crimes very early on in January, when actually it wasn't nearly as bad as what happened by May 2009.